Hello and welcome to How to Write a Basic Ethics Paper. I'm Borcoman, your instructor this semester, and I hope in what follows you'll get a very good feel for what the expectations are with respect to writing a basic 5-page paper. First of all, of course, you're going to start with the introduction. In what follows, we'll go into specific detail about what to do with an introductory set of paragraphs. Then you'll move on to the main body. Extremely important to assure that you follow this format so that ultimately the argument that you put forth in defense of your particular position will be coherent, make good sense to those reading it. You probably should strive for approximately 5 paragraphs of material, and this would amount to approximately 5 pages. I'm sure in what follows you'll be able to determine just exactly how you might be able to accomplish that. And of course, no paper is worth its weight unless it has a conclusion. Again, more detail follows. Thank you for joining me. Please feel free to contact me if you need to. I'll be available to take a look at any rough drafts you might want to send my way. Once again, welcome to Writing a Basic Ethics Paper. I am Borcoman, and in what follows, I hope to be able to disclose to you in a very basic outline form what the requirements would be for writing an ethics paper for my course, and hopefully there will be some implication for other courses you might take in philosophy or perhaps another class such as English, particularly if you have to support or substantiate a position, provide warrant for it, etc. First of all essays are pretty much broken up, particularly for relatively short essays, into an introduction, main body, and conclusion. In the introduction, as you probably already know, you state your topic, and you can do this in about a paragraph. An example would be, in this paper, I will show that the plan to kill innocent people to save many others is morally wrong. And of course, what I'm going to do is suggest that you might consider an illustration out of a movie, and the one that I've selected for this particular topic is the 1995 movie entitled Outbreak, with Dustin Hoffman, Rene Russo, and Morgan Freeman, and some others as well. In this particular movie, which is a good idea sometimes, by the way, if you happen perhaps to choose a moral scenario out of some movie, to go ahead and give a bit of a synopsis. So what is the synoptic plot of the movie Outbreak? The film focuses on the outbreak of a fictional Ebola-like virus called Motaba in Zaire. And then later it makes its appearance in a small town in the United States. It's a fictitious town called Cedar Creek. Primary settings are government disease control centers, particularly such as the CDC. And again, that town called Cedar Creek. The movie Outbreak shows just how far the military and civilian agencies might go in order to contain the spread. And of course there, what you discover is you're going to get into some very interesting moral implications and scenarios. Let's go ahead and take a look, just for the sake of argument, so you get a very good idea, at the video trailer on the movie Outbreak.
In a remote African jungle, a small monkey is captured. Bound for a pet store in America, the animal carries a deadly virus.
I know that some of us have doubts about what we're about to do. It would be less than human if we didn't. But the fate of the nation, perhaps the world, is in our hands. We cannot, we dare not refuse this burden. I'm confident that each of you will do his duty. God forgive us.
Your town is being quarantined.
We got 19 dead. We got 100 more infected, spreading like a brush fire. What are you talking about?
If one of them's got it, then 10 of them got it now.
And if one of them gets out of Cedar Creek, we have a very interesting problem.
If that bug gets out of there, 260 million Americans will be dead or dying.
I'm leaving with the team in an hour.
From the heart of a small California town
Damn it, Sam, I almost think this is the same as you.
to the inner circle of power in Washington.
The most optimistic projection for the spread of the virus is this: 24 hours, 36 hours, 48 hours.
The greatest medical crisis of all time
We can't stop it.
begins.
Try to remain calm.
Many people are dying and are going to continue to die unless we find this monkey.
There will be panic the likes of which we have never seen.
There you are!
Attention, Portland residents, citizens of San Diego, residents of Atlanta, Denver residents of Detroit, and Dallas residents of Chicago.
And so as you can see, it might be a movie that would be worth actually taking a look at on your own to see the full version of it. And I'm not making a recommendation to you about your viewing habits, but you might want to get a fuller feel for that. But it so happens that oftentimes the trailer does actually cover some of the basic points, and you can kind of tell that there's a little bit of stress and strain between two main objectives. You've got Dustin Hoffman, the protagonist, who's very much concerned about the well-being and the justice and the morality of what the military and maybe other institutions in the United States government are about ready to do. Then, of course, you have the antagonist, played here by Donald Sutherland. Does a very good job of portraying a rather nasty, villainous type of military individual who's willing to go ahead and go to great lengths in order to try to achieve his goals. So there you have the dynamic tension. And as movies go, it's not the worst one, certainly, I've ever seen, and it certainly does exemplify and illustrate what we're talking about here in this presentation. So, let's say we're going to use that movie, or at least the scenario out of it. In the first paragraph of your paper, the introductory sections, you might try starting your paper with a sentence like this. I will argue that taking the lives of the people in the city of Cedar Creek, or any such city, in order to prevent the spread of an Ebola-type virus is wrong from a deontological point of view. So, now I'm giving you the sort of short version of this. Obviously, in a paper, you're probably going to tell a little bit more of a story about what's actually going on with respect to Cedar Creek and what is about ready to happen. And I might point out that there are two forms, by the way, of utilitarianism that you may want to bring up at some point in time in the course of your paper. Let's say that there is this need, according to some, to take out the infected city of Cedar Creek and all of its inhabitants. An act utilitarian might argue that in this specific situation, that would be the result of this would be producing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. A rule utilitarian might say, under any circumstances in which you have a Cedar Creek-like scenario, you would proceed to do that. So I hope you understand and appreciate that there is a slight distinction between what we call rule utilitarianism on the one hand and act utilitarianism on the other. And either of those, by the way, you could, depending on how you're arguing, choose to argue against. So in any case, let's say that you are going to argue that it's wrong to take the lives of the people in the city of Cedar Creek. Now, what you're going to do generally in your first paragraph in the introductory section is to actually state right up front what the reasons are. And you could assert yourself in this fashion. You could say, this is because such an act violates, first, the dignity of basic human beings, basic human rights. Second, there may be actually other alternatives that ought to be explored. And lastly, it actually treats, this kind of activity treats people merely as a means to an end. They are not, in other words, on this view, according to the view that is being taken here, people are not being treated as of intrinsic value and as ends in their own right. They're being treated as means to somebody else's end, whether that be an institution, a government, an organization, or some such other agent or entity. Now, let's say that, again, your position is do not bomb the city. Remember, the video was actually portraying that they were about ready to decimate that city with military activity. First premise, it violates the autonomy of the people living there. And that includes things like their own pursuit of happiness, their entitlement to go ahead and go on to live. Possibly even you might argue that their dignity is being offended against here in the course of what the government is about ready to do. Second, there might be other alternatives. Perhaps they should be explored. Perhaps a little bit more time ought to be taken in order to explore those alternatives. And lastly, and you might say, if you were arguing in the way in which I'm portraying it here, most importantly, it treats people merely as means, not as ends in themselves, as we just stated. Now, if I wanted to expand upon one of the main premises, I would probably, if I were to do this myself, go ahead and expand on the last one I just mentioned, but you would be expanding on all of them. This is just an example of what to do. You've got essentially 3 premises that are defending your main claim here, that it is wrong to take out the people of Cedar City or a city like that under those circumstances. Immanuel Kant stated in his groundwork the following: act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means to an end. So it's very important that at least in one of those premises, an attempt is made to try to identify a principle. Because what you are arguing ultimately, certainly in an ethics paper, in all likelihood, is that somebody should or should not do something. Somebody ought or ought not do something. And if I am creating an argument in which my conclusion, my main claim really, is that the military ought not lay waste to the city to try to destroy the virus, and as a consequence kill its people, I'm saying it ought not do that. So to get to that ought in a conclusion or the main claim, it's necessary that there be a moral principle, because as you know, moral principles are about how we should or should not do things, generally speaking, and they are enframed, so to speak, in specific moral orientations. The main ones being deontology, utilitarian, and, as we have discussed, Greek or Archaic ethics. And, of course, if you're going to be quoting anybody at all, certainly Mr. Immanuel Kant, you're going to be putting a footnote there. Now, what's very important, what some people don't do, but I think that this, at the very least, is a way of showing that you have prepared yourself and thought about coherently what your position is. You've developed an appropriate warrant and justification for your position. So it's a good idea to include the main arguments that might be against the view that you have just been espousing. So in the main body still, but in another paragraph or separate set of paragraphs, you might say something like the following. However, a utilitarian might actually say that it's justified to kill a comparative few amount of people for the sake of the far greater good, or lesser evil, if you will, of the greatest number. Moreover, it might be possible to measure this. I think that that's what you see in one of the characters there that's portrayed by Donald Sutherland. And you probably get a better feel for it if you actually saw the whole movie. But when we're talking about the holding off the spread of this virus and preventing it from multiplying, and apparently, according to that little brief image of a map you saw there in the trailer, it looks like what would be happening there is that there would be a geometric or exponential growth, flourishing, so to speak, of that nasty little virus. So there, obviously, it is safe to say that if it is not contained in some fashion or another, there could be a very serious problem. Generally speaking, you have read about, if you've read at all about utilitarianism, you've heard of something called the philosophic calculus, which some version of that might be appropriate here. You might be able to calculate the amount of good over the amount of harm, and conclude that the amount of good is greatly enhanced if certain measures are taken against that little town of people in California. Of course, the basic moral orientation on this objection to the view that you would be primarily advancing is a utilitarian objection to your deontological view. So hopefully you see how that goes. It's very straightforward in this particular situation, and while it is not absolutely necessary to provide arguments against your view, it is not a bad tactic to take. And we might then, at this point, if we're writing a paper, want to expatiate upon the principle of utilitarianism and actually talk a little bit about what utilitarianism says, that the proper course of action is the one that maximizes the overall good of the greatest number of individuals. And of course, you can footnote that and reference that and find that in a variety of places, not only on the internet, but in other publications that have to do with moral theory, including the book that I principally choose, Ethics Discovering Right and Wrong, by the now deceased Mr. Borcoman, and an associate of his who I think has taken up the banner of his work. But there are sometimes appropriate places in your paper where you were going to want to provide a footnote or cite a reference. And while I don't deal with that specifically in this particular presentation, you have been learning, I'm sure, in your college career and writing career, that perhaps if you use the MLA method of footnoting or some standard methods of footnoting proffered by your instructors, you'll be just fine. And, of course, what we're saying here, too, with respect to this utilitarian principle is that if you incinerate that little city of Cedar Creek, destroy it entirely and utterly, and probably take out the virus, and I think you have to emphasize probably, you'll end up maybe saving a whole lot of other lives. And let's face it, common sense would tell you that if that were to be the case, with everything being measured out properly, in a kind of a philosophic or hedonic calculus sort of way, then the quantification would weigh heavily on the side of the utilitarians, quite conceivably. But at the same time, as compelling as that argument is, that argument that was launched against your particular position, there is a reply that you are going to have to come up with, because you have picked out now, ideally, the very best argument against your view, and what you're going to do now is try to provide your very best argument against the argument against your view. See how that works? So, one thing you might mention here is that one cannot know with a high degree of probability, or certainty even, that the bombing of the city will actually destroy the infection. We don't know for sure if it will. What happens if it doesn't? And then the infection is still roaming about in the atmosphere somewhere, and some adjacent town or a town 100 miles away all of a sudden has inhabitants that start showing signs and symptoms of this Ebola-type viral infection. Wouldn't that be a way of suggesting that perhaps then all of those people who were sacrificed, that sacrifice itself, was ineffectual, even from a utilitarian point of view? One of the greatest problems, of course, with utilitarianism, too, is the generic critique, and that is, or criticism, and that is, how do we measure the greatest good? Anyway, in what sense? That more people live in this particular scenario with greater health, vitality, they don't become infected. Surely those are good things, but it is in principle a rather difficult thing to try to provide the measurement of something like that. And another classic problem that utilitarianism might have is the idea that bombing that city with all of its inhabitants is counterintuitive. A destructive act like that, it's hard to tell that it could result in a maximum amount of good for the greatest number. Of course, we run into situations like that in wartime, and the classic case it's always mentioned is the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II to quote-unquote end that war. That was those two acts were probably counterintuitive from certain moral postures, but perhaps at the time perceived as necessary. I leave that to you to decide, by the way, whether or not that kind of bombing is necessary. But when you're done now, ultimately, giving your best argument against the counter-argument to your position, and showing that it doesn't really work, then you can now come to a conclusion. And what you would do in a conclusion is normally restate, in different wording, of course, the thesis of your introductory paragraph or so. An introduction, by the way, might be 2 paragraphs, and you're not really held to the what I'm calling a 5-paragraph rule, where let's say you have a paragraph in the introduction, 3 paragraphs or so in the main body, a paragraph or so in the conclusion. This is not a mechanical, robotic kind of activity or exercise that one wants you to undertake, because you're going to inflect it a little bit with your own personality, your own thoughts, your own preferences, really. But structurally speaking, this is pretty much roughly what the expectation would be. Even if it were a longer protracted essay or thesis, a dissertation, you'd pretty much have this kind of a pattern. In a conclusion, not only do you restate what you actually said in the introduction, you're actually, in a sense, recapping, summarizing the main points that you've made in the intro and perhaps in the main body. And you might want to go on to suggest why the subject is important or interesting anyway. I know it may seem to you that it is just utterly important, but think about it. You might go on to suggest that your conclusions might be applied to other circumstances that in fact aren't based simply on fictional works, novels, movies, books, but have real life applications. And an example would be something like the following, if you were to actually write up a little paragraph. Something like this. I have shown that it would violate the basic principles of deontological ethics, read their Kantian ethics, to destroy a or any small city like Cedar Glen to stop the spread of a lethal virus. Such action violates one of the versions of Kant's categorical imperative, namely, do not treat people merely as means but as ends in themselves. So, you have pretty much wired this, so to speak, in an appropriate fashion, so as to follow a format that clearly shows that you are thinking about not only the structure of what you're arguing about, and that's what this is an argument, but also the content, and also its further application to real-life cases. I think that when you put that all together, you're actually probably going to have a relatively good paper. Sounds to me like if you follow all these things, and you have a coherent, sound argument overall, that you'll probably get an A. Another thing I often get asked whenever I make presentations about how to write a paper is whether or not it's appropriate to use the word I. I admit that if perhaps you're using it a little bit too much in a sentence or a paragraph, like 50 instances of I in a paragraph might indicate some issue that one has with one's writing technique, unless it's a piece of poetry, of course, or perhaps some issue that one has with one's own ego, or perhaps even a narcissistic background with respect to one's writing orientation. In my experience, however, most philosophers prefer that a person use I, because after all, it's that you are the one, quote unquote, the one that fills in the missing blank for the I, that's arguing. Computers cannot argue. Machines cannot argue. They do not have what you call intentionality. Only humans, as far as we know, have that, and perhaps some other creatures do, but they don't have the linguistic skills to be able to express it. Secondly, using I judiciously is a little easier than going into, I suppose, what you call the third person. In this paper, it has been shown that. Notice the difference. In this paper, it has been shown versus, in this paper, I have shown that. You're the one that's making the claim. So philosophers generally have no problem attaching the claim to the person. In fact, it's persons that make claims. So in any case, you may have a writing style that you prefer, that you have been taught and raised with, and that's fine. But if you follow this basic format, I think that you'll probably have some guarantee towards getting a far better grade. Thank you very much for joining me. And if you have any problems, as always, issues, if you happen to be one of my classes and you're looking at this presentation, you want to get in contact with me and have me look at a rough draft, I will do my best to give you very straightforward kinds of advice, if not just commentary that you can take or leave. But I, of course, can't tell you exactly what to write in your paper. Take good care. Thank you for joining me.